Hi, I'm going to present a learning theory review. I hope that this will be review for you because all of DBT is based on learning theory, so you have to understand this thoroughly in order to be successful in the class. So principle one is that all behavior is caused. Learning theory explains the causes of behavior. No matter what your theoretical orientation is now or will be in the future, a working knowledge of learning theory is very important. Humans are born able to respond to only a small number of rewards because the rewards we respond to are linked to survival. Those are all primary rewards. The human reward classes are food, novel and interesting stimuli, physical comfort, affection, others' responses to our caregiving, dominance, power, and sex. Humans also have inborn or innate responses to threatening stimuli and situations. These are linked to fear, anxiety, and anger. The ethological model gives us a way to think about reward systems as they relate to various behaviors that individuals have. So the model shows us that the animal or individual person comes predisposed to respond to key stimuli, which are called releasers because they release behavior linked to consuming those stimuli or avoiding those stimuli. Stimuli signal the presence of rewards with survival value. Animals and people are born predisposed to respond to different rewards. Ethologists call these responses innate releasing mechanisms. The idea is that the stimuli is a releaser and the releasing mechanism is in the brain and the brain responds to the stimuli. So for example, Cinnabon donuts for Cinnabon buns for me. I have an innate response to them in that I really like them. And so the smell and the sight of the Cinnabon stimulates my brain, and then that activates my modal action pattern, which is to get the Cinnabon and eat it. And these consequences of eating it, if I'm undernourished, will be survival, and if I'm overnourished, will be ill health. So basically, all stimuli act according to the model that you see here. So behaviors linked to rewards are repeated and sometimes inborn. So for example, sucking is an inborn behavior linked to the reward of eating for babies. And we know from observing great apes that affectionate responses like kissing and hugging each other, those are probably also inborn. Mating behaviors are inborn. So this gets us to an important thing to realize, and that is that just like we have systems that regulate our physiology, we have behavioral systems. So a system is an entity that has a goal. So for example, our behavioral systems are all linked to survival goals. And these are feeding, attachment, caregiving, power, and sex. Those are pretty much the primary survival goals. Now, for the survival of the society, we need people to respond to novelty and interesting stimuli so that we can create technologies. So that's also a survival goal. You could say novelty seeking or achievement might be that system. Could also be called the curiosity systems. So here's our system that has a goal. So let's just say the attachment system, for example. So the goal of the attachment system is safety through being close to caregiving others. So safety and also obtaining care. Obtaining care and safety through association with providers of care. That's the attachment system. So this goal is represented in the system. And as that is in the child, the system has a representation that if I'm hungry, I go tell my mother, and my mother will feed me. Or if I feel scared, I cry out, and my mother or father will come and rescue me. So since the system has this goal of safety and obtaining nurturing from another, there are various stimuli or variables in the environment that are going to trigger the system. So for example, the attachment system is triggered by strangers feeling unsafe. And that stranger is represented in the brain, which then triggers the goal of being safe. And then the brain enacts a decision to seek safety with the other, and that will be the action. So the child then seeks proximity to the caregiver, and then that influences their sense of safety, and so on. There is a constant interaction between the system, the behaviors, and then the stimuli in the environment. So systems process, so the behavioral systems, they process information. So for example, with attachment, the attachment system in the child is processing information about the relative nurturing and provision of safety that a caregiver is providing for the child. And then the actions that are initiated by the system, or the behaviors that individuals do, impact the environment. The child that goes and seeks security with the parent may do it in such a way that the parent feels fulfilled and wants to protect the child. And so the child is then impacting his or her environment by the behaviors that it's doing. Or if the child acts scared in the presence of a stranger, maybe the stranger will withdraw. So all rewarding behavior, whether it's sexual reward, power reward, attachment reward, caring reward, are all processed through what's called the behavioral activation system, or the brain reward system. This brain reward system involves a circuit in the brain, which includes the prefrontal cortex, the reward center, also called the NAC, or nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, which assigns value to stimuli, and the ventral tegmental area, which supplies dopamine to the system. Also, I didn't put on this slide, is the hippocampus, which retains memories for the events or for the behaviors, etc., of the system. So probably a lot of our internal working memories are in the amygdala and hippocampus. The behavioral inhibition system is a bit more complicated. There's not a nice circuit. The behavioral inhibition system processes threat, and involves some of the same brain regions as you see here. So the medial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, which assigns value to stimuli. The amygdala has two parts to it, the basolateral amygdala and the central amygdala. They interact with each other. The hippocampus is important in emotional memory, and the DG is the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus. And also the hypothalamus is important for hormonal responses to stress. The ventral tegmental area is responsible again for making dopamine, which creates the drive for behavior. And the nucleus accumbens processes reward. And in the case of the behavioral inhibition system, reward would be the absence of threat. So learning takes place through changes in the behavioral activation system and the behavioral inhibition system circuits. Learning is defined as a change in behavior due to experience. There are three types of learning important for this class: habituation and/or sensitization, classical conditioning, and operant conditioning. Sensitization is an increased response following stimulation. Habituation is learning not to respond to the repeated presentation of a stimulus. Habituation is the basis of PTSD and anxiety treatment. Also, examples of habituation would include emergency sirens in the city and the aplesia withdrawal, gill withdrawal reflex. This video So you see the snail stopped responding to the Q-tip by the third presentation of the Q-tip. So that was habituation. So the idea, the clinical relevance of habituation is that if you can be next to something that used to scares you and you can learn not to respond, then after a while you won't be scared anymore. Classical conditioning is called conditioning by antecedents, and this is demonstrated by the famous Pavlov dog experiment. In this experiment, an unconditioned stimulus, which is food, is presented to the dog who salivates, and that's the unconditioned response. So you can think of this as a reflex: food, reflex, salivation. Then we have a tone paired with this whole process. Well, we have a tone which by itself does not elicit anything. Then we go down here, we have the tone paired with this whole process. So this is conditioning by what comes before, or conditioning by antecedents, because we sound the tone, we give the food, the dog salivates. And then sure enough, after repeated trials, the dog will salivate only to the tone. Now, if you have a dog, you might notice that when you pick up the leash or you get up to put your shoes on, that the dog will act excited and get ready to go outside. So that's another example of classical conditioning, where the stimulus of the leash or the stimulus of you putting your shoes on has become a conditioned stimulus to the behavior of going outside. So there are 5 components of this classical conditioning. You have a neutral stimulus, you have an unconditioned stimulus, you have an unconditioned response, and then you have a conditioned stimulus, which in this case was the tone, and a conditioned response, which was the salivation. So you know the conditioned stimulus and response because normally the animal doesn't respond to them at all. So in the case of the dog, the unconditioned stimulus was automatic, didn't have to be learned. And the unconditioned response was salivating. And then during acquisition, the neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus, and after several trials, the neutral stimulus gradually begins to elicit the same response as the unconditioned stimulus. So we say then that the tone equals the food, and we say that learning has happened or response has been acquired. The conditioned stimulus is the original neutral stimulus that gains the power to cause the response. In Pavlov's experience, the bell or tone began to produce the same response that the food once did. So if you think about this, during trauma, learning occurs in one trial. And once that learning has occurred, it can be very difficult to extinguish. So clinical examples of classical conditioning: you ate at an ethnic restaurant and got sick, then you feel ill at the thought of that same food. And I just said ethnic restaurant because if it's food you eat every day, you might not become conditioned because you're used to the food. So when I just said this, not to disparage any sort of ethnic food, but just to say you ate food that you don't always eat. You ate some unusual food, and then you can develop a conditioned aversion to the food that you ate that came before you got sick. And that can happen whether or not the reason for getting sick was due to the food. Another example, your lover wears a cologne or perfume, and that smell now causes arousal and you like it. So think about how you can use this to pair smells, tastes, and sounds with relaxation to help people relax using sensory stimulation. So it doesn't just work with aversion, it can also work with relaxation and good feelings. Now, so that's classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is another form of learning, and it is learning by consequences. An operant is an observable behavior that an organism uses to operate in the environment. Operant conditioning is a form of learning in which the probability of the response is changed by its consequences. That is, by stimuli that follows the response, or conditioning by consequence. And this form of learning was studied by B.F. Skinner and gave rise to behaviorism. A reinforcer is a condition in which the presentation or removal of a stimulus that occurs after a response and strengthens that response or makes it more likely to happen again in the future. Positive reinforcement happens when the stimulus presented after a response increases the probability of that response happening again. So, for example, getting paid for good grades might increase the probability of good grades in the future. Negative reinforcement occurs when a unpleasant stimulus is removed. So I have a stimulus, maybe my nagging. I'm nagging you to get your work done, and you do your work to shut me up. That's an example of negative reinforcement. So negative reinforcement is reinforcement in that behavior is always increased with reinforcement, and negative reinforcement happens when you remove something that the individual doesn't like, and that increases the behavior probability. Examples might include taking Advil to get rid of a headache, or putting on a seatbelt to make the annoying seatbelt buzzer stop. In terms of reinforcement, the word positive means to add or apply. The word negative is used to mean subtract or remove. On the other hand, a punishment is an averse or dislike stimulus which occurs after a behavior and decreases the probability that behavior will occur again, or at least in theory. Negative punishment happens when a desirable event ends or is taken away after a behavior. For example, getting grounded from your cell phone after failing a test. So positive and negative reinforcement both make the behavior more likely to happen in the future, versus positive and negative punishment both make the behavior less likely to happen in the future. Punishment and negative reinforcement are used to produce opposite effects on behavior. Punishment is used to decrease a behavior or reduce its probability of recurring. Negative reinforcement always increases a behavior's probability of happening in the future by taking away an unwanted stimuli. Remember, positive means adding something and negative means removing something. Reinforcement and punishment are two different processes. The reason is reinforcement acts on the reward center of the brain, whereas punishment acts on the inhibition system of the brain. Unlike reinforcement, punishment must be administered constantly. Intermittent punishment is far less effective than punishment delivered after every undesired behavior. In fact, not punishing every misbehavior can have the effect of rewarding the behavior, because you escape a punishment when you do the behavior, and that makes it rewarding. So the bottom line for you to remember is that punishment does not work. And when you're dealing with children and families, we need to get them away from the idea of using punishment. Punishment and reinforcement are two different things because one acts on the reward system and the other acts on the inhibition system. And it's very difficult to inhibit behavior that a person wants to do. It's much more effective to give them an alternative behavior that's rewarding. So instead of inhibiting a behavior, you want to replace a behavior with something else. Punishment rarely works in the long run for 4 reasons. 1, the power of punishment to suppress behavior usually disappears when the threat of punishment is gone. So parents should not use it because if they're not around, their kids will do whatever they want to anyway. Punishment often triggers escape or aggression or stress, and that can have the opposite effect, especially if you're punishing a child for acting aggressively. So spanking a child for being aggressive is completely ridiculous. Punishment makes the learner apprehensive, and anxiety inhibits learning. And punishment is often applied inconsistently. So you're going to have to come to grips with all of these things because I know that this goes against much of what you've been practicing a lot of your life, probably, or believe to be true. And we also have to figure out how to help parents understand that punishment is not so effective. So in terms of punishment in clinical work, know what punishment is and how it is different from reinforcement. People are used to punishing each other. That punishing behavior may be easily acquired due to inborn tendencies. Clients may be resistant to the idea of giving up punishing other people, particularly children and romantic partners, because the clients think that punishment works. If I scream at you when you don't do what I want, then maybe you'll do what I want. Think about your own beliefs in order to work with others. Do you think punishment is effective in shaping children's behavior? Do you yell at your family members to get them to do what you want? You don't have to tell me the answer to those questions. We all yell at our family members every once in a while. So this gets me to behavioral chain analysis, which I'm not going to cover that much in this class other than to mention what it is. It is general handout 7 in the DBT skills. And in chain analysis, we help clients explore what the consequences of problem behavior are in order to change the person's pattern of behavior. And also we want to especially identify prompting events and the links between prompting events and problem behaviors, and also identify people's vulnerabilities. So for example, a vulnerability might be addiction. A prompting event might be seeing someone on the street that you used to use with, and then the links might be thinking and dwelling upon use and how fun it was to use with that person. And then the problem behavior might be returning to use, and the consequences might be that you got high and you felt better, but then there might have also been other consequences. So I think what we'll be doing is looking at this chain analysis more in the strategies class or more in your internship and practicum if this is something you're interested in exploring.